You started waking up early. You went to the gym 3 days in a row. You journaled every night for almost 2 weeks. And then one morning, without any dramatic reason, you just stopped. There was no crisis, no emergency, no conscious decision to quit. You simply woke up, felt nothing pulling you toward the habit, and returned to exactly who you were before you started. And now, somewhere in the back of your mind, there is a quiet voice telling you that you failed again. But here is the part no one explains to you. You did not fail because of laziness. You did not fail because of weak willpower. You failed because you were performing a behavior that did not match who you believe you are. And until that internal mismatch is resolved, no habit tracker, no morning routine, and no amount of discipline will save you. Most people think of habits as actions. Wake up early. Drink water. Read 10 pages. Exercise. And because they think of habits as actions, they approach them with action-based strategies. They set alarms, build schedules, create streaks, and use apps. But the brain does not sustain behavior based on logistics. It sustains behavior based on identity. There is a profound difference between doing something and being someone who does that thing. When you force yourself to go for a run, your brain treats it as a task. It processes the effort, calculates the discomfort, and compares it against the reward. And most of the time, the reward is not immediate enough to justify the friction. But when someone who identifies as a runner goes for a run, the brain does not need to calculate anything. The behavior is congruent with the self-image. It flows without resistance because it is simply what that person does. This is not a metaphor. This is how the brain conserves energy. It defaults to behaviors that align with its internal model of who you are. The psychological term for this is identity-based behavior. Your brain maintains something researchers call a self-concept, which is essentially a collection of beliefs you hold about who you are. These beliefs are not stored in one place. They are distributed across neural networks that activate every time you make a decision, respond to a situation, or evaluate whether something is worth doing. When a behavior aligns with your self-concept, the prefrontal cortex does not need to work as hard. The decision feels natural. It requires less executive function, less deliberation, and less willpower. But when a behavior conflicts with your self-concept, the brain flags it as foreign. It activates resistance. You feel friction not because the habit is hard, but because it does not feel like you. Think about what happens when someone who has never exercised suddenly decides to become a gym person. On day 1, they feel motivated. By day 4, something shifts. They look in the mirror and do not see a gym person. They walk into the weight room and feel like an imposter. Their internal narrative says things like, "This is not who I am." And the brain listens to that narrative more than it listens to any alarm or calendar reminder. The self-concept acts as a filter. It decides which behaviors are allowed to become automatic and which ones will always require conscious effort. If the identity does not update, the behavior stays effortful forever. An effortful behavior always has an expiration date. This is why willpower-based habit strategies almost always collapse. Willpower is a function of the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex is the most energy-expensive region of the brain. It fatigues quickly. It is the first system to degrade under stress, sleep deprivation, decision fatigue, and emotional overwhelm. When you rely on willpower to sustain a habit, you're relying on the least reliable part of your brain to do the most demanding job. And the moment life gets difficult, which it always does, the prefrontal cortex pulls back and the default identity takes over. You do not fall back to your lowest level of motivation. You fall back to your deepest level of identity. That is the invisible ceiling most people never see. Now, here is where the environment makes things worse. Modern digital life is constantly reinforcing your existing identity. Social media algorithms learn who you are and feed you content that confirms it. Your phone usage patterns, your browsing habits, your entertainment choices, all of them create a feedback loop that solidifies the self-concept you already have. If you spend 4 hours a night scrolling through short-form content and consuming passive entertainment, your brain encodes that as part of who you are. It becomes your default mode. And then when you try to sit down and read a book or work on a project, the brain resists because that behavior does not match the identity that has been reinforced thousands of times through repetition. You're not fighting the habit. You're fighting an identity that has been quietly shaped by your environment without your conscious awareness. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called cognitive dissonance, and it plays a direct role in why habits fail. Cognitive dissonance occurs when there is a conflict between what you do and what you believe about yourself. The brain does not tolerate this conflict well. It needs resolution. And there are only two ways to resolve it. Either you change the belief to match the behavior, or you change the behavior to match the belief. Most of the time, the belief wins. So when someone who internally identifies as a disorganized person tries to maintain a clean workspace, the dissonance builds. The brain says, this does not match. And instead of updating the identity, it drops the behavior. The workspace gets messy again. The person concludes they just are not a tidy person. And the cycle reinforces itself. This is the loop that traps millions of people. They try a new habit. They sustain it briefly through sheer effort. Their identity does not shift. Cognitive dissonance builds. The brain resolves the dissonance by abandoning the behavior. The person interprets this as personal failure, which further reinforces the old identity. Now the belief is even stronger. I always quit. I have no discipline. I am not the kind of person who sticks with things. These are not just thoughts. They are identity statements. And every time someone repeats them, the neural pathways associated with that self-concept get stronger. The brain literally wires itself around the belief, making it harder to override with each passing cycle. So how does identity actually change? This is where most advice gets it wrong. People say things like, just believe in yourself, or visualize the person you want to become. But identity does not shift through affirmation. It shifts through evidence. The brain updates its self-concept based on repeated proof, not one experience, not a burst of motivation. Repeated, small-scale evidence that contradicts the old belief. If someone believes they are not a disciplined person, the path forward is not to suddenly become disciplined. It is to create micro-experiences where discipline occurs and then consciously acknowledge them. Each acknowledgement sends a signal to the brain. Each signal slightly loosens the grip of the old identity. Over time, the self-concept begins to update. But this process is slow, and it requires a kind of patience that most people do not associate with habit formation. There is a neurological basis for this. The brain uses something called prediction coding, which means it constantly generates predictions about what you will do based on past behavior. When you act in alignment with those predictions, the brain reinforces the existing model. When you act against those predictions, the brain generates a prediction error. Prediction errors are how the brain learns. They are signals that say, something unexpected happened. Update the model. But here's the critical part. One prediction error is not enough. The brain needs repeated prediction errors, delivered consistently, before it revises the internal model. This is why doing a habit once or twice, and then quitting, has almost no impact on identity. The brain dismisses it as noise. But doing it 20, 30, 50 times starts to register as a pattern, and patterns are what the brain uses to build identity. This also explains why starting small is not just practical advice, but is psychologically essential. When someone tries to overhaul their entire life at once, they generate massive cognitive dissonance with almost no evidence to support the new identity. The gap between who they are and who they are trying to be is too large for the brain to process. It triggers threat responses. Anxiety rises. Motivation collapses. The brain essentially says, This is too far from baseline. Return to safety. But when someone starts with something absurdly small, like reading one page instead of a chapter, the dissonance is minimal. The brain tolerates it. And because the behavior actually gets completed, evidence is generated. That evidence begins to chip away at the old identity without triggering the alarm system. There is another layer to this that most people overlook, and it involves the role of dopamine in identity reinforcement. Dopamine is not just a reward chemical. It is a motivation and learning chemical. It reinforces behaviors that the brain associates with positive outcomes. When a behavior aligns with identity, dopamine flows more easily because the brain anticipates the outcome as congruent and safe. But when a behavior conflicts with identity, the dopamine signal is weaker because the brain is uncertain about the outcome. This means that identity-mismatched habits literally feel less rewarding, even if the actual outcome is positive. You could have a great workout, feel physically good afterward, and still not feel motivated to go again because the dopamine system did not fully engage. The reward was real, but the brain did not encode it as meaningful because it did not fit the internal story. This is why two people can do the exact same habit and have completely different experiences. One person journals every morning and feels clarity. Another person journals and feels like they are wasting time. The activity is identical. The difference is in the identity layer. One person sees journaling as part of who they are. The other sees it as something they are trying to force into a life that does not have room for it. The brain interprets the same behavior differently, depending on how it maps to the self-concept. And this interpretation determines whether the habit will be sustained or discarded. So what does this mean practically? It means that the entry point for lasting behavior change is not the behavior itself. It is the story you tell yourself about who you are, not in a vague motivational sense, in a concrete neurological sense. The narrative you repeat internally is the code your brain runs on. If your internal narrative says, "I am not a morning person," your brain will resist every attempt to wake up early. Not because waking up early is hard, but because it violates the code. Changing that narrative requires replacing it with evidence-based microstatements. Not, "I am a morning person," when you clearly are not. But I woke up at 7 today. That is something I did. Small, factual, undeniable. The brain cannot argue with facts. And facts, repeated over time, rewrite the narrative. The environment must also shift to support the new identity. If your surroundings constantly reinforce the old self-concept, the new identity will not survive. This means auditing your inputs. What are you consuming? What messages are you absorbing passively? Are your digital habits reinforcing someone you want to become, or are they anchoring you to someone you are trying to leave behind? The brain does not distinguish between active and passive learning. It encodes everything. So the content you scroll through at midnight is shaping your self-concept, just as much as the goals you write down in the morning. The environment is not neutral. It is either building the new identity or defending the old one. There is also a social dimension to identity that matters deeply. Humans are social creatures, and the brain uses social feedback as a major input for self-concept formation. If the people around you see you as a certain kind of person and treat you accordingly, your brain absorbs that signal. It becomes part of the internal model. This is why people often revert to old behaviors when they return to old social environments. The social signals reset the identity. Conversely, when someone enters a new social context where they are seen differently, the identity begins to shift. Not because they are pretending, but because the brain is receiving new data about who it might be. The real reason habits fail is not a failure of effort. It is a failure of alignment. The behavior you are trying to adopt does not match the person you believe yourself to be. And until that belief updates, the behavior will always feel like swimming against a current. You might make progress for a while. You might even impress yourself. But the moment the effort becomes unsustainable, the current pulls you back. The only way to change the current is to change the identity beneath it. And that does not happen overnight. It happens through small, consistent actions, consciously acknowledged, repeated long enough for the brain to say, maybe this is who we are now. The next time you feel a habit slipping, do not ask yourself what you need to do differently. Ask yourself who you believe you are. That question holds more power than any strategy, any system, or any app ever could. Because at the end of the day, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your identity. An identity, unlike motivation, does not fade with time. It deepens.